So tonight our presentation is about alchemical symbolism, the language of science, and mysticism. So my dears, we're going to start with a kind of overview and really talk about the background of alchemy as an early science. Alchemy was considered both a science and, of course, a highly symbolic, though enigmatic language. Alchemy is not just a precursor to modern chemistry, nor is its purpose a lust for gold. Alchemy is highly symbolic of the search for personal transformation and inner wisdom. Called the great work, in Latin, the opus magnum, this quest is illustrated by its imagery, and here on your left you see the Mons Philosophorum, translated as the mountain of the philosophers or the mountain of the wise. This is image of the Alchemist done by Rembrandt on your left, that painting from about 1652. Rembrandt also did a kind of line sketch that you can find in the Amsterdam Rijksmuseum of the Alchemist. But let's talk about the painting on the left for a moment. There's some important symbols here. We have the seated philosopher or alchemist in a kind of literal brown study. He has his hands clasped, which may mean that he is in contemplative prayer or in meditation. We have a man at the top of the staircase, and this person looks like descending the staircase, but it's also a spiral. So it is a symbol for the ascending and descending consciousness. There's a person in the lower corner of that painting who is possibly the apprentice. And the apprentice job was really to keep the fires burning. And all of us as neophytes and students in our order understand that every day we're given certain lessons in the monographs, and we are supposed to follow these. That is, we keep the inner fire burning. On the right, we have the alchemist, and sometimes this image, and it was called by Rembrandt the Faustus, but not Dr. Faustus. It's the Dutch Faustus, an alchemist, and he is having a vision. Now, later writers used these images to create their work. For instance, Victor Hugo and Goethe were inspired by these images done by Rembrandt to create their stories about the legendary Faust who sold his soul, that is, to increase his wealth and to kind of abhor divine knowledge in place of having material knowledge and success. So that's really one of the morals of the Faustian story. But here we have Rembrandt's earlier image, and you see in the background of the sketch a skull, which is in the tradition of the memento mori, which is to remind us that life is short. We don't have a lot of time on this plane and in a single incarnation, and we need to make the most of it. Now, you see certain letters here in the vision, and I want to remind you that the INRI, although it's often used in a Christian religious context, is translated as Jesus Nazarenus Rex Judaeorum, which means Jesus of Nazareth, or Jesus the Nazarene, or Yeshua, as we say in Greek. And it's a very interesting difference in transformational alchemy, because as part of the Rosicrucian tradition, the INRI refers to igni natura renovatur integra, meaning by fire, nature is renewed whole, to achieve not just material, but spiritual renewal and enlightenment, often symbolized by the phoenix. What is the purpose of alchemy? The mystic understands that the microcosm mirrors the macrocosm, and you see that evidenced in this image. We have the divine in the upper portion of the image, and then we have nature, humanity in the lower portion. And what seems to connect these in this particular alchemical image is, of course, the process of alchemical transformation. As a sacred science, alchemy invites the sincere seeker to unveil the secrets of nature and to seek union with the divine. The opus magnum, or great work, describes the purpose of the alchemist or mystic. the sincere seeker who makes a conscious effort, that is, has to be done consciously, and it takes a bit of work to achieve the highest state of purity. Now, the question is, could alchemists truly transform lead to gold? Well, such was the fear that an influx of gold would ruin the European economy that alchemy was outlawed and punishable by death in the 1700s in England, which is the age of enlightenment when so-called reason ruled. It is also true that in the 12th century, in 1317, Pope John the 22nd issued a decree prohibiting the practice of alchemy, mainly because there were so many charlatans attempting to fake the creation of gold, etc. So alchemy has had an interesting history, and there's one of the reasons for its use of secret symbols is, of course, to keep it away from accusations of heresy, and also to protect those who used it. So sometimes pseudonyms were used instead of persons' real names. Now today, if we want to make the link with science about changing lead to gold, at CERN, that is the European Council for Nuclear Research, the Hadron Collider, that is the Large Hadron Collider, do you see the LHC there, has created gold from lead using an electromagnetic dissociation process, and that was between 2015 and 18. This process uses lead particles that pass each other close to the speed of light, and that takes an enormous amount of energy in order to do that. And here's an image from CERN that shows you lead, the element of lead, and these two particles passing each other on the left at close to the speed of light. And what happens as a result of that process, that a few electrons and protons are knocked off lead, and it becomes literally the element gold. There are other processes in chemistry, of course, some that don't create real gold, but I also know the alchemist Steve Kalick, who has created a form of gold using regular alchemical processes and patience, of course. The gold of alchemy is symbolic. And this is a quotation from the Majorcan alchemist Raymond Lull, who lived from the 13th to the 14th centuries. And this is what he says, and watch carefully how he frames this. The difference between real gold, that is the element gold, and spiritual gold. And gold is more precious than any other color, and its substance more precious than any other physical substance. So does the intellect rise aloft, elevating incomparably above the choice of sense, the separate spiritual substances which dwell above all the heavenly bodies. And the purest and most perfect gold of all, a gold of absolute purity, dwells infinitely and incomparably above the lower forms of gold, which stand far below it. This painting is called Alchemist Heating a Pot by David Tenier the Younger, and it's a 17th century artist who created this. This is a metaphor for the many spiritual exercises that are practiced daily in order to purify and refine the self. And these were also practiced by the alchemist, but also by mystics and students who study spirituality and the spiritual arts in an attempt to create their own kind of refinement of the self. This book is called Cosmology, or Universal Science by Means of the Secret Symbols of the Rosicrucians, and it is a translation from German into English in 1888 by Franz Hartmann. It was published in Boston, and that is 100 years after the Altona edition of the Secret Symbols. But although it's lesser in the sense that it doesn't have as many illustrations and far less text, and is inferior for that reason, it, however, does include an interesting glossary of terms. And this is the definition of alchemy that Hartmann provides: the science of guiding the invisible processes of life for the purpose of attaining certain results on the material or spiritual plane. Alchemy is not only a science, but an art, for the power to exercise it must be acquired. Persons must first come into possession of certain powers before they can be taught how to employ them. They must know what life is and learn to control life processes within their own being. He goes on to say that chemistry is not alchemy. The former deals with so-called dead substances, the latter with the principle of life. The composition or decomposition of a chemical substance is a chemical process. The growth of a tree or animal, an alchemical process. The highest alchemy, he states, is the evolution of a divine and immortal being out of a mortal semi-animal human. Now, we're going to take a brief historical tour of some of the more important texts in Arabic. And one of the oldest European alchemical texts translated from Arabic is the Turba Philosophorum. And its original text is dated around 900 to 1000 after the Common Era. Turba Philosophorum refers to the assembly of the philosophers, and you see them here in an illustration having a debate. Here, the philosophers that include Pythagoras, and he is the one who's pointing to the heavens and also pointing to the earth and the fire at his feet. That's Pythagoras. He's discussing with Euripides, and you see here various kings and other philosophers from various ages. They're also speaking in different languages. One is in German, others are in other languages, and we have the language of alchemy, however, in solve coagula, so dissolve and coagulate, which are very important in the 7 steps of alchemy. And we have dissolve, corpa, the body, in aqua or water. But this is interesting because they're discussing matter and its properties, cosmology, and they conclude that there are 4 basic elements governed by the divine. So where did Islamic alchemy derive this notion from? Well, from the Greeks. So Arabic alchemy derived its understanding from Greek philosophy that included Hellenistic Egypt. So at one point after the pharaohs, we have the Greeks, who are very important in the history of Egypt and also in alchemy and the time of Hermeticism. This is an image of the Picatrix, which is the title of a 1612 manuscript, and it can be seen at the Hagia Sophia in Istanbul. It is a 400-page treatise on astrology, alchemy, Hermeticism, and magic. And this is an illustration of Hermes Trismegistus holding the emerald tablet. It's from 1339, and it also can be seen in a library in Istanbul. Alchemy and practical chemistry were studied in medieval Islam, and during the Renaissance or Renaissance, Arab culture and knowledge came to Europe after the Islamic Moors took Spain in 711 ACE. And then many texts were translated from Arabic into Spanish, for instance, and into Latin in particular. But we also have several universities established by the Muslims in Spain, in places like Toledo, for example, where the study of these texts became very important. One of these is the Golden Treatise by Tib al-Rida. And notice it's around the same time as the Turba Philosophorum. And we have an interesting historical context here, especially those of you who are interested in medicine, because it is probably the most revered historical text that offers medical advice on diet, exercise, and hygiene. And hygiene, of course, is very important in avoiding the spread of disease. It includes physiology, chemistry, alchemy, and pathology. It begins by asserting that the heart is king, and the vessels, blood, organs, and brain serve the heart. And we know today that science is reasserting the heart's power over the brain. And if you have your blood supply cut off to the brain and the brain fails or aspects of it die, then the person, as the expression of the outward person, also will transition. And that illustration is from a 16th century Ottoman manuscript that depicts the Shia Imam Ali al-Rida. But of course, because that's centuries after the actual person lived, and you will see that also in later examples, that often these are imaginary portraits of possibly how someone might have looked at the time. Now, who is Robert of Chester? He lived in the 1100s, and he was the translator, one of the main translators of Arabic texts into Latin. He was an Englishman and a monk, and he was the first to translate the Quran in 1144. His most influential work was his translation of Geber's or Jabir's compendium on alchemy that included the Emerald Tablet. Also, he translated Arabic algebra in 1145, which was previously unknown in Europe. And it's interesting in the same year that there was a Hebrew scholar who was also translating algebra from Arabic into Hebrew. So 1145 was a significant year. The word alchemy likely derives from the Egyptian word kemet, meaning black soil, which was due to the Nile traditionally overflowing and enriching the soil in Egypt, Upper and Lower Egypt, or also from the Hebrew kimya, which means divine science. Now, I mentioned the secret symbols of the Rosicrucians of the 16th and 17th centuries, and it's important to know that the Mons Philosophorum appears in the first book because it's actually divided into two books, first one from 1785, and the Mons Philosophorum that you see again here without color was likely inspired by the writings of Denis Secquer. He was a 16th century French alchemist, or his name is sometimes written as Dionysius Zachariah. The Altona edition of the Secret Symbols, as I say, it's in two books, but we have it on our website. So if you go to rosicrucian.org, under texts, you will find the secret symbols of the Rosicrucians of the 16th and 17th centuries. And it's quite a large compilation of texts and images. It also contains a bibliography of references and includes the Hartmann from 1888. We know that the Rosarium Philosophorum, which is the Rose Garden of the Wise, or of Philosophy, from 1550 of 20 woodcuts, also appeared a very similar style to the Mons Philosophorum. Now, at the bottom of the image, you will see the year 1604, and I'll tell you in a moment why that's significant. I think if I take a minute, it would be useful to at least analyze this image. You see there an old man sitting on a stump. He is naked, and in a way that represents his being stripped of materiality. There are three persons who are chasing after potentially a rabbit here, who is about to enter its hutch or hole in the ground, but it emerges again on the first level above the wall. The body could be, the human body could be a representation of the mountain of the philosophers. And the old man, you, the alchemist, the mystic, the one who is entering within in order to discover the secrets of the divine. And here he is, although he has a kind of ethereal quest or transcendent quest, he is still rooted to the earth. These persons who are looking for something, and the rabbit in the secret symbols suggests that they are looking for alchemy itself, the royal art, are missing it because they're looking in the wrong direction. But from the alchemist's perspective, once he enters the garden or the mountain, sorry, and he's here at the first level, there is possibly, it might be a hen signifying gestation, a rooster that crows to wake you in the morning, awake, be more awake and alert to those things that are important, and remember to be maybe more asleep to the things that aren't so important, and recognize the difference. Or you'll see in the next image that it might be a slightly different creature. Here we have a dragon and the lion. Often you'll see in alchemy, the lion and the dragon are at odds with each other. It is called the royal art, and we see the crown above and the royal sphere. at the very top, which signifies reaching enlightenment, but the lion also appears to block the path to the next level, which indicates at a certain stage, the mystic or the aspiring alchemist is maybe overwhelmed by pride, thinks he knows a little bit more than the others who are just searching still on the outside and haven't quite reached this step yet. So the idea is that this person must be devoured by the lion before he can go any further. The other creatures here, the raven and the eagle, represent stages in alchemy. We see the sun and the moon having a bath. The alchemist, again, who has an uprooted tree with certain symbols in it. And on the opposite side, these stars, which represent the three principles, salt, sulfur, and mercury, the tria prima. Here we have a house, and notice, like the Athenor, we're keeping the fires burning. That is, we have to do the work on a daily basis. And, things are cooking on the inside before the mountain is reached. And we see again the sun and the moon above, because again, that's very important imagery. And the year is 1604. Now we see the same image without the date. It is part of the title page of a German text that in German it says Die natürliche Philosophia, but that is the natural philosophy. And I'll translate what it says, and it's on the text toward the left side here. The natural philosophy about the changing of metals in gold and silver through the highest secret, which would create the philosopher's stone. After the author, the world-famous, weltberühmte Philosophus, Herr Dionysius Zacharias, der Rechten Doctor in Paris. So he's the right doctor, which means he's a doctor of law. But we know also that this person was an alchemist, and the date at the bottom of the page is 1724, which is well before the secret symbols, which remember is a compendium. So why 1604? Some of you will recognize this portrait as John Amos Comenius, who was a 16th, 17th century alchemist and a Czech educator. He stated everything must be taught to everyone. When he was a child, he was orphaned. Both his mother and his father passed through transition, and he went to live with an aunt. But they were very poor, and he was not given an education until he was practically a young man in his teen years, which was very unusual. But he was very bright. And this experience taught him something very important. And he's famous for this expression, everything must be taught to everyone, regardless of race, culture, social standing, finances, men, women, children, everything. So really, he was very much in favor and promoted universal education. He corresponded with Johann Valentine Andrea, who was the self-proclaimed Rosicrucian author of The Chemical Wedding of Christian Rosenkreuz in 1459, although, of course, that text is one of the Rosicrucian manifestos, and it was published in 1616. 1459 was an important year, especially historically, because it was the beginnings of the war between Austria and Hungary, which affected all of Europe. Comenius had read the Fama Fraternitatis in German before it was officially released in 1614. He read it in 1612. So he's very much interested in Rosicrucianism. Now, I need to explain before we go further that there were two world views. This on the left was the dominant world view. And if you think about it, this is still the dominant world view, especially in the West and particularly in North America. It is the great chain of being. From 1579, that is the illustration from a book, Rhetorica Christiana. I want to explain this diagram a little bit so that you understand the reasoning behind the great chain of being, which is also based on the Greeks and particularly on Aristotle, although it has here Christian significance. We see the divine on his throne with his son at his feet. We also see that this is on fire. It's burning because It is so ineffable and beyond. And these angels, the seraphim, are the highest angels. They turn towards the divine, their faces are to the divine, and they are also burning, according to Dionysius the Areopagite. Dionysius the Areopagite, likely also a pseudonym, is responsible for telling us that there are 3 times 3 ranks of angels, and they are also given names. And here we see them represented on a cloud, and this is the divine realm. Right below that is humanity, and people stand on the earth. And here is a woman seemingly, apparently giving birth, but also, and you see how these levels have their special seals attached to them. Below humanity is nature. And we have 3 levels. We have the birds of the air, the fishes and creatures of the sea, and the animal kingdom. And below that, we have trees and vegetation, and below that, minerals or rocks. We also see the fall of angels. So Lucifer here at the bottom on fire. And this is a power structure. If you contrast it to the other worldview, the tree of Pansophia, it's a very different kind of structure. So here, divinity is not personified. It is an energy, and the words omnia ab uno appear at the top. This tree from 1604 is represented, or it's drawn and published in 1618 in a book called The Mirror of the Wisdom of the Rosy Cross. And it's by, again, a pseudonym for this particular person, Daniel Mögling. We now know that through historical research. Another 17th century alchemist and mystic. He used the name Schweighardt. So look at the difference between these two. Nature here is an emanation from the divine. And by the way, omnia ab uno is Latin for all from one. And we have the 4 elements: fire, earth, we have water and air. And below that, we have the vegetable kingdom, the mineral kingdom, and the microcosm, humanity, that is a representation of all of these things. And we have the Azoth, the Alpha and the Omega, the A to Z. We'll be talking about the Azoth toward the end of the presentation very shortly. We also have in Latin TB, the TIBI, which is to you. All of this, the microcosm, is embodied in you. And at the very bottom, we have veritas simplex, or the simple truth. The one thing I want to add about the great chain of being, it was the rationale for humanity's dominance over nature, that humans could exploit nature and use it to their own benefit because they were seen as higher on the great chain. Each level has the attributes of the one below it and more. So for instance, the mineral level, just rocks, for instance, they exist, whereas at least the vegetable matter has life. Animals have some intelligence, but again, compared to humans, not so much in this vision of the great chain. And as I say, it likely still informs much of the Western world's thinking. Paracelsus, and I cannot go in a presentation without talking about Paracelsus and alchemy, because he's very important to the Rosicrucian tradition. And he was called the great philosopher, Paracelsi. And this is the 16th century Rosicrucian portrait. He was a natural philosopher, an alchemist, a physician, and he's really considered the father of pharmacy. He insisted that we use observation over traditional texts, para meaning beyond, hence Paracelsus, beyond Celsus, the 1st century medical writer. And you see him there, Celsus, in the window over the shoulder of Paracelsus. Nature, for Paracelsus, was a conscious living force from which we can learn. He felt that midwives had more knowledge than ancient texts. So he lived among the people and he traveled widely throughout Europe. Dosage was everything in creating and taking healing medicines. Too much or too little could do more harm than good. He revolutionized both medicine and alchemy. And the statement in Latin over at the top of the image here is, let no person belong to another who can belong to himself or herself. William Harvey was a traditional Rosicrucian. He was royal physician to 2 kings. He likely met the astronomer Galileo, since Harvey studied in Padua and also visited Florence. He was an English doctor physic, which meant he was both a physiologist and a pathologist, and he was a member of the Royal College of Physicians and Surgeons. Harvey, although not the first, experimented and wrote about the heart's role in the circulation of the blood, and his work, De Motu Cordis, that is about the motion of the heart, was published posthumously a year after his death in 1628. In 1615, he was the Lumleyan, after a person named Lumley, who started a lecture series. He was the Lumleyan lecturer for 7 years. And he's quoted as saying his goal was spreading light concerning anatomy, animal and human. He knew Francis Bacon and stated that Bacon wrote philosophy like a chancellor. And we're not sure whether that's a compliment or not. So regardless, I do want to remind you of the 17th century Rosicrucian manifestos and when they were published. So at the beginning of the 17th century, we have first the Fama. We see it in English here, the Fama Fraternitatis, or a discovery of the fraternity of the most laudable order of the Rosy Cross. And here in the original German, and the widely publication date of 1614. The Confessio appears a year later, and then the Chemische Hochzeit of Christian Rosenkreuzer, or the alchemical wedding of Christian Rosenkreuz from 1616. The Paris announcement occurred in 1623, when posters were placed all over the city of Paris, beginning with this paragraph: "We, the deputies of the higher college of the Rose Croix, do make our stay visibly and invisibly in this city, by the grace of the Most High, to whom turn the hearts of the just. We demonstrate and instruct without books and distinctions the ability to speak all manners of tongues of the countries where we choose to be, in order to draw our fellow creatures from error of death." And that's very important, because the search for the elixir of life, for instance, is really about the knowledge of our own immortality. The next paragraph talks about how those who seek the Rosicrucians or the Rosicrucians merely from curiosity will not find them. This is called the Invisible College of the Rosy Cross, or simply the Invisible College. It was published again by Schweikart in 1618, which is very close to the appearance of the manifestos. And you see here at the top, Collegium Fraternitatis and Fama, meaning the fame of the college fraternity, 1618. So why is it called invisible? Well, not everyone is looking for it, even though it might be right in front of them. And you see people at the bottom of the image. Some of them are going about their business. They don't even see this invisible college that appears right there. Now, the other interesting fact, if you look at it closely, is that it has wheels and a drawbridge. So it travels from country to country among communities, and it has an entrance that can also be closed for protection. The sword on the left has the word caveat. That's an older spelling of the word caveat, and it's really there warning about misinterpretation. It announces itself to the world, and you see the trumpet blaring, the CRF, and also you see individuals with quill pens shielded by the divine. They are carrying shields, and they are also writing about this very important knowledge that they wish to disseminate to those who are worthy. So it is directed by the divine, and you see the wings above, but its members also seek to understand nature, and they're working within the laboratory. and Jesus Nobis Omni. We have also the Christ and the Christ consciousness as the most noble. So they're also associated with Christianity in Europe, but above the door, the other door, not the drawbridge door, but the one facing us, we see in Latin the words, "Come, worthy ones, venite digni." And we also see the red rose and the Templar cross. Now, what does that have to do with science? Well, there's a very important connection, and it has to do with the Royal Society, which was established by the king at the time on the 28th of November in 1660. And its website today, and that's its coat of arms and its logo, it describes itself thusly: a fellowship of many of the world's most eminent scientists. It is the oldest scientific academy in continuous existence. In its early form, it was a small group of natural philosophers and Rosicrucians who called themselves the Invisible College. Later members included Isaac Newton, who was the 12th president of the Royal Society until his transition in 1727. And earlier during his tenure as president, Benjamin Franklin visited England, founded a marvelous society and wrote about it extensively, and made several trips back and forth to England, and Franklin also then to France. And he called himself a natural philosopher. Robert Boyle was an Anglo-Irish natural philosopher, an alchemist, inventor, and Rosicrucian, and he was one of the founders of the Royal College. He's considered the first modern chemist. He described himself and his colleagues as the Invisible College prior to 1660, and they never revealed really their meeting place. They would meet in various places like cafes or whatever and discuss science and alchemy. His most known contribution to modern science is called Boyle's Law. Some of you who've studied, of course, science, either in high school or university, will recall that it describes how gases behave under increasing pressure. Volume decreases as the pressure rises, and vice versa. At Boyle's transition, his death, Newton tried to obtain Boyle's alchemical writings, but Boyle had left a caveat in his will that stated no one was to receive his papers, and mainly the reason was it was dangerous for anyone to possess alchemical papers at that time. We have 9 years after the Royal College is established, Hennig Brandt discovers phosphorus in 1669. In Hamburg, or northern Germany, Brandt's discovery was created by heating sand and charcoal with 1,200 gallons of boiled down urine. And I expect that that was from livestock. Regardless, even for decades later, until the discovery of certain phosphates, urine was used to create phosphorus. So a substance never seen before. Brandt called it phosphorus from Latin, to give off light. 100 years later, it appeared in chemistry textbooks. Here, Brandt kneels in reverence and in gratitude, because remember, the microcosm and the macrocosm, the divine infuses nature. His laboratory work centered on creating the philosopher's stone. Now, a little bit about Isaac Newton. You know that his most famous work is on gravity, and it's called The Natural Philosophy, the Principles of Mathematics, in which he outlines the laws of gravity. That was published in 1668, just the year before Brandt's discovery of phosphorus. Reluctant to publish, it took 38 years for Newton to realize his work on calculus, or release it. And that created a controversy with Leibniz in Germany, because Leibniz published first. And nowadays, if you publish first, you're the one who gets the acclaim as the one who invented something. Newton claims that in his early 20s, he had already created the formulation for calculus. Newton wrote extensively about alchemy and the search for the philosopher's stone, including Artifice, or Artephius, his secret book, could be pronounced Artifice, his secret book of the blessed stone called the Philosophers. So notice that it was published in 1624, which does not coincide with Newton's birth. It is well before. And because alchemy was looked down upon by this time, he had to hide the fact that he was an alchemist. He also studied papers that he had on Nicholas Flamel, and he wrote a study of Flamel's hieroglyphic symbols. Newton had one of the most extensive libraries and personal notes on alchemy in Europe at the time. There is an apocryphal story, we don't know whether it's true or not, that he had a fire in which some of his alchemical papers burned, and there are scientists who say today who would say good riddance, say they don't want anything to do with alchemy is, considered not a real science. It's about things immaterial. Why should we even study those papers? They should have all been burned. And here is, of course, a warning to those of you who may fall asleep meditating in your sanctum with a lit candle. It's important to beware of the danger of this particular tragedy happening. And I want to remind you that during the 1700s, with its emphasis on reason, the Age of Enlightenment just beginning at the end of the 1600s, unsanctioned alchemical practice was a criminal offense in England, punishable by public hanging on a gilded platform to make fun of those who studied alchemy and the desire to create gold from lead. Previously scoffed at, Newton's remaining papers were then given to relatives who preserved them, and then later these were sold at auction in the 20th century and now are the subject of study, as we shall see. The Perimeter Institute for Theoretical Physics is located in Waterloo, Ontario, Canada. It was founded in 1999 and explores advances in chemistry, astronomy, and physics. William R. Newman, pictured here, presented a lecture titled, "Why Did Isaac Newton Believe in Alchemy?" at the Perimeter Institute in 2010. Newton was very interested in Boyle's alchemical writings on transmutation, mutability, and immutability in particular, because they led to Newton's experiments in optics. And this image is from William R. Newman's paper, Newton's Early Optical Theory and Its Debt to Chemistry. And chemistry here is spelled in relation to alchemy. A prism could create spectral colors, and a lens could reassemble them. So Newton's alchemical ideas on immutability led to his writings and experiments in optics, so much so that he even invented a form of reflecting telescope using mirrors and lenses. I have a reflecting telescope myself with a 10-inch mirror in my bedroom right now. So, frauders and sorors, friends, spiritual transformation is the key. The magnum opus or great work of alchemy is the discovery of the inner gem. So what is exactly the philosopher's stone? A clue exists in the symbol of the rose and the cross. If the rose represents the greater light or cosmic soul, the cross then is mundane existence itself with its trials and potential suffering. All of us face challenges, whether they're health, finances, relationships, whatever. No life is unscathed. And through our earthly existence, we learn, we grow, and we transmute, or as someone said to me, alchemize. The marriage of both rose and cross creates the opportunity for self-discovery and self-realization, and that's you. The symbol of the rose and cross represent the human being, the mundane or the corporeal self, and the spiritual self. And here we have Robert Fludd's Rose Cross, the Dat Rosa Malapibus, which is translated as the rose gives honey from the bees, not to the bees, from the bees. The rose offers nectar. It's the bees in the hive we see on the right of the image that convert that in community into honey. So the bees themselves here are on the rose or approaching the rose, but there's also the spider. And in the left corner of the image at the bottom, we see a representation of the snares, the distractions, the things that steer us away from the spiritual path in the mundane world. In Latin, we all, as students of the Rose Cross, know this phrase, ad rosem per crucum, ad crucum per rosem. To the rose by way of the cross, to the cross by way of the rose. In it, the rose, in them, the rose and the cross, I emerge once more as a precious stone. Now, who is Basil Valentine? And there's a question mark here because he may or may not have existed. He was supposed to be a Benedictine monk who was born in the 14th century, or toward the end of it, but historically now we know likely it was many of the writings of Johann Tölde, who was a 16th, 17th century mystic, a businessman. He was a manufacturer and also an alchemist. And there's a large compendium of work and images that are attributed to Basil Valentine. He was important, his writings, because of chemical discoveries that included ammonium chloride, ethyl chloride, and sulfuric acid, which was also at that time called oil of vitriol. These were all discovered as part of alchemical experiments, although, of course, in Arabic alchemy, centuries before, these things had already been discovered, including sulfuric acid. These images are important because they're side by side with Frater Basilius or Frater Basil Valentinus. He is beside Hermes Trismegistus, again, the Oriental philosopher or the Eastern philosopher of Hermeticism, who's holding an astrolabe in one hand to represent his knowledge of astronomy and cosmology, and the alembic of alchemy. And we see the sun in the corner there, the rays reflected through a lens to create heat for the furnace of alchemy. We also see representations of vibration and harmony, music. We have the lute, and above it, we have organ pipes. We also have theory and practice. So we have books, and we have actual alchemical work, and we have alchemical symbols above the head of Basil Valentine. We have the interlaced triangles with the sun at its center, also representing gold, and the Mars, the sigil for Mars, pointing at that representation of as above, so below. We see the lion devouring the dragon and the sun above, of course. Now, the Rosicrucian tradition in alchemy is related to this short form vitriol. Visit the interior of the earth, and by rectification, you will find the hidden stone. And rectification means really purification, because that was the idea of dissolving, coagulating, distilling, burning, and also recombining spirit, body, and soul in alchemy. This is from Basil Valentine's book, Azoth. It is the second image in a series. And remember that alchemy and Hermeticism and their profound symbolism were and still are vehicles for contemplation and meditation. Here's the Azoth again, 1659. Visit the interior of the earth, and by transformation or transmutation, you will find the hidden stone. And this is again a representation of the 7 stages of alchemy, and they're numbered here, beginning with burning. When you turn to black ash, we have the raven, and then it turns to white ash, and we go around, and we also see mercury here as the 5th stage, and that is the alchemist's face. This is a mandala that was used for meditation. Azoth combines English, Greek, and Hebrew. It represents the A to Z, alpha and omega, and aleph and tav of internal transformation sought by the alchemists. It is also called the universal principle of life and stands for Mercury, or that mercurial aspect of the vital life force hidden in all living things. The cipher for Mercury is also the symbol of the philosopher's stone. And here we see it in color. It's just slightly different and in a slightly different order as the previous one here, because Mercury is at stage 6 rather than 5. And what does the tria prima have to do with the 4 elements? The tria prima, as mentioned before, were Mercury, spiritus, that's energy, Salt, corpus, and we see it here at the bottom of the image, refers to the body or matter, and sulfur, anima, to fire or the soul. So the tria prima in alchemy are spirit, body, and soul. And really, they're interesting combination of the four elements. So mercury is the passive humid principle. It is air and water. Salt, the fixed earthy principle, earth and water. And sulfur represents the active, mutable, fiery principle, fire and air. So as a practicing alchemist, you would study these combinations. So where do we find the Philosopher's Stone? And this image from Michael Mayer's Atalanta Fugians from 1617, again, just following the Rosicrucian manifestos, gives you a clue. So we have geometry here, our visual links to Pythagorean mathematics. And this is a quotation from Peter Binden's Digest article. The alchemical squaring of the circle consists of adding a cross lying at the philosopher's feet to a microcosmic sphere, and we see the microcosmic couple, which is then converted into a square, the four elements, then into a triangle, the tria prima of body, spirit, and soul. The triangle finally transforms into the great sphere of the macrocosmic, called the Philosopher's Stone. And that image, without the people in it, is often used, that geometric shape, as another symbol for the Philosopher's Stone. And those of you who own the book, The Kabbalion, will see it often on the front cover. Note also on the paper at the feet of the philosopher here, there's a circle, and there are interlaced triangles, and a quotation from Peter Binden representing the twofold process of ascending and descending that will culminate in our linking with cosmic consciousness. And we're almost finished here. What is the elixir of life? Elixir, the, Xeres, stone. Elixir equals the stone. This elixir could produce a tincture, a powder, an ointment, or a liquid. The elixir of life is also referred to as the quintessence or the fifth element, and finding it is the secret to immortality. That is, metaphorically, it represents the knowledge of our own soul consciousness. And here we have the front door of the Nicolas Flamel house, the oldest house still existing in Paris. And you will see this inscription, Ora et Labora, pray and work, or as Rosicrucians say, work and worship. Flamel was said to have found the elixir of life. And as promised, I wanted to explain the rubification of the soul. Lapidum philosophorum, or stone of the wise, is an ancient symbol for enlightenment and takes various forms. It can be an egg-like sphere, a crystal, as depicted here, or even a liquid. The most blessed stone is depicted as red, and the red king of sulfur, whose union with Mercury, the white queen, creates the gold of the alchemists. In spiritual alchemy, the search for the stone involves our own transformation at the level of the heart, where the rose evolves and blooms. The unfolding rose symbolizes beauty, purity, and spiritual evolution. And now the symbolism of the cross. The intersection point is the point of manifestation, where the divine and the material plane meet. As a primordial symbol and archetype, the cross represents immortality. The vertical line is the divine or spiritual principle ascending and descending into matter, the horizontal line. The trilobed or trifoliate cross has further symbolic meaning in Hermetic alchemy of body, soul, and spirit. And you see here the alchemical symbols for salt, for instance, mercury and sulfur on each of the lobes of the rose cross. This is the Hermetic rose cross. We see other symbols here, including the INRI, and remember that is Igni Natura Renovator Integra. By fire, nature is renewed whole. And in the middle, we have you, the microcosm, the larger cross, the macrocosm, which includes all of nature. And the red rose symbolism. The red rose was the alchemical symbol of the completion of the great work. Once it's truly unfolded, its outcome ultimately produced the stone of the philosophers. It is partly because of this symbol of completion that the rose that adorns the Rosicrucian trifoliate cross is red and not some other symbolic color. That is a quote from former Grand Master Peter Binden, who has since passed through transition. And finally, the Ouroboros. This is the same principle of the divine descending into matter. It is also called the prima materia, and it shows the movement of life, the circle of life, also called the one thing. And this quotation from Alchemist Dennis Hoke: through the meditation of one mind, so do all created things originate from this one thing through transformation. And finally, in conclusion, the marriage of science and mysticism, here illustrated in the story of the chemical wedding of Christian Rosenkreutz. As above, so below, as within, so without. Mystical transformation is about understanding nature, its laws and principles, in other words, science, and mastering oneself, mysticism. By mastering simple but basic practices like meditation, concentration, and visualization, you are indeed engaged in the great work, and you will find the elixir of life and the stone of the philosophers. So mote it be.